Kia ora koutou katoa, ko John Reid taku ingoa. Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tāwara or Tuai. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand. Today we're going to talk about the programme of work that is being led by Dunedin City Council to address flood risk in the area of South Dunedin. We're joined today by Jonathan Rowe. Jonathan is the Programme Manager for South Dunedin Future, a joint initiative between the Dunedin City Council and Otago Regional Council to develop a climate adaptation master plan for this very flat, low-lying part of the city. Kia ora, Emily and Jonathan.
Kia ora, thanks for having us, John.
Kia ora.
Thanks for joining us today. Before we start, I thought I'd give you a quick update from our other co-host, Hannah Edmund. Her son, Freddie, was born at the end of August, and she'll be on parental leave for about next year and back with us to continue podcasting. So many congratulations to her. And Emily, over to you.
Tautoko, massive congratulations to Hannah and Freddie. And welcome, Jonathan. Nau mai hara mai ki Tāwara o te wai. To start us off, perhaps you could give us some background about the issues that the community are facing in South Dunedin.
The whole city's got about 130,000 people, depending on where the students are at any particular time. So about 10% of that population lives in an area called South Dunedin, which is this sort of flat, low-lying wetland area or former wetland area that's kind of right in the middle of the city. It's wedged between Otago Harbour, the south coast, and the surrounding hill suburb. And it hosts a whole lot of housing, a whole lot of the city's critical infrastructure. So think kind of big ticket things like Transpower substation and a lot of the sports facilities, a lot of our industrial land, some Three Waters critical infrastructure and the like. So kind of the central hub of the city, other parts of the city of the spoke. So really important. But it's also really low lying. So a lot of it's sort of between half a metre to a metre above mean average sea level. So there are large parts that are currently below high tide. It's got a history of flooding. And we know that with the onset of the impacts of climate change, more severe and more frequent, storm events, rising seas, rising groundwater, it's going to have a real challenge with water. So the South Dunedin Future program is basically a multi-year initiative to figure out, well, how do we respond to all of those challenges? What are the options on the table and which one's the best for us?
It sounds pretty exciting, really. It's sort of big picture. What is your role in that, Jonathan?
It is exciting. It's also a big challenge. So basically, I'm the, I guess you could call the MC or the conductor. Formally, my title is program manager. So basically, I'm the guy that's trying to coordinate the science, the engineering, the planning work, the community engagement, the comms around it all, to try and pull this sort of multidisciplinary piece of work together and ultimately work through a series of steps to produce a master plan for that part of the city that'll ultimately outline sort of how we might tackle these challenges over coming decades, all the way out to sort of 100 years. And then what are some of those really big moves in terms of, say, infrastructure investment or land use change or really big social decisions like managed retreat?
So the whole flood risk picture is very complex, but you've got to be able to communicate that really clearly to the public. How are you going about that sort of comms picture?
It's a massive challenge. It is. So, not everyone's an engineer. So not everyone understands that complex side of sort of how you might deal with pumps and pipes and move water around. Similarly, not everyone's a scientist. So understanding, why it rains the way it does, where it does, how it interacts with groundwater, how that might change with future climate impacts and rising seas, and then all of this sort of associated impacts that those changes might have on the things that matter to us, so people, places, our homes, communities. So it is a really complex web. Essentially, what we've had to do over the last sort of 4 or 5 years is try and distill some of that down to some really key messages. Some of that's just around things like the 5 stages of the program. So, for example, understanding what's happening, how the environment's changing, understanding how that's going to impact on us, what we can do about that on that spectrum of fight and flight, and then how we might make that happen over time. So some really, really key kind of simple messages like that. Also, it took us a long time to kind of figure out what's the program actually trying to do. We can't sort of solve every problem. So what are the ones we're trying to save and how are we going to do that? And we ended up kind of landing on this really short, simple phrase around making the place safer and better. And I can talk a little bit about why that's really important, but safer in the sense of safer from flooding. So less flooding despite this kind of trajectory of increasing flood hazard and flood risk, but also better in the sense of, hey, if we do need to change because we've got this really changing environment, if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to get worse outcomes. There's enormous opportunity that comes with that change. So there's an opportunity to get better housing, to get better infrastructure, to get more green space, to ultimately create an urban environment that's actually better than the one that we've got now. So that's been really critical in terms of the comms.
It sounds that there's been a lot of strength in the program through this open dialogue and distilling scientific communications. A few podcasts ago, we talked about the human aspects of flooding, which I think you've been touching on here. How have you managed to bring together the technical engineering and scientific aspects with the humanity of dealing with this complex issue, bringing the community along on the story? Perhaps you could expand on that a little more.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really complex problem, and in many ways it broke the council. So about the genesis for this work is a big flood in 2015, flooded large parts of South Dunedin, was extensive damage, sort of homes and shops and infrastructure. And it really led to this big fracturing between the council and the community. Subsequent investigations determined that, yep, council infrastructure had underperformed. There were things that council should have done better in, and that contributed to the flood. But it also sort of sparked this big debate around, is it just the infrastructure? And if we'd fixed that, would it have all been fine? Or is it just climate change? And the reality is it's neither, right? Or it's both. But that process, the kind of human element of that, people were really upset, legitimately so, and held very firm views about what the problem was and who was responsible. And it took, I would say, 3 or 4 years of dialogue between the council and the community to get past that point and then get to a stage where essentially people were ready to start talking about what next, rather than just kind of looking around, pointing fingers and maybe talking about all the problems in the past. That was a really key step, but a really difficult one. And a lot of it involved the council kind of stepping up, owning previous mistakes, but also kind of saying, hey, we don't have the answers to all of this right now, but we want to talk about it. We want to understand what people want and what they think. And the next step for us is really to design a process for eating that elephant, right? So what do these steps look like? What are the bite-sized pieces and how might that work?
It sounds like there's a number of different people who have come to be part of this dialogue, and it's a unique element. Hearing everyone's voices around the community and with councils can be quite a challenge. Perhaps you could elaborate on how you managed to reach the engagement that you have.
I think council realised very early on we were going to need partners in this, and from a full spectrum of partners. So one around kind of reshaping that partnership with the community, and the community led a lot of that. There were groups that emerged after that 2015 flood that said, actually, we want to have a constructive, active dialogue with the council about this. We want to hold them to account, but we also want to provide a safe space in which we can have this dialogue, because it is very raw. It needs to be robust. It's really impactful. At the same time, if council staff keep turning up to town hall meetings and get shouted at, they're going to stop turning up. So what sort of emerged from that process was a group called the South Dunedin Community Network, and they essentially took on that mantle of providing that space, being a sort of conduit for the community, and have continued to this day. So I still have a lot of conversations, meeting, and they're a really key partner for us. Also, obviously, the collaboration between the two councils. So you've got the regional council, Otago Regional Council, which would typically lead on the sort of scientific and technical stuff. So they really leaned into things like all of the monitoring of the environmental changes out there, including groundwater investigations. They had subsequent partnerships with NIWA and Genius Science and others. So you started to get this real web of partnerships and people contributing to helping solve this really complex problem. Also working with mana whenua around how they might see this place, this land, and how that had really helping us develop our thinking and the narrative around how there used to be a lot of water in this place, pre-European settlement. it was mahinga kai, gathering area eels. There was transport routes through the tide. The water would rise and fall with the seasons, the tides, the cycles. And it's only really since European settlement that we've re-engineered it. We've built up, built out, pushed the water out. And, because we've burnt a lot of fossil fuels in the intervening 180 years, that water's pushing back in many respects. So that really helped us kind of think about, okay, ultimately this is a conversation about balance and, how much are we going to continue to fight and engineer? How much do we want to maybe look at recreating some of those spaces that used to be there where maybe the water could go, where it could rise and fall? And what does that mean? What are the impact of those changes on Te Tao, on the environment, on the people, on the community, and how do we kind of assess those trade-offs? So lots of different perspectives. We're also really blessed in Dunedin to have a fabulous university. So we had a range of partnerships with the University of Otago, very much a team effort.
It's really fascinating. You hit me with the word balance as well. And it sounds like, listening to some of those kōrero, perhaps pūrākau from mana whenua of the past, the stories of that wai and whenua, understanding the implications of climate change and having so many technical and scientific minds around the table while also hearing the voices of the community. It sounds like quite a vision is being set that can hopefully lean into the next pathway forward.
A lot of that has led to the foundations of that master planning process and what does the future look like, and what are the options on the table and how should we think about those. And I think this is where that term balance really carries over, because ultimately what we do in the future is a conversation about trade-offs. How much change are we willing to undergo, at what cost, who carries that cost, and at what rate of change is sustainable.
So that's talking a lot about the approach and understanding some of the background. What do you think the future is going to look like? What are some of the solutions that you're working towards? Because South Dunedin isn't the only low-lying part of New Zealand that is at risk of flooding. So I'm hoping that some of these approaches might be able to be picked up and used elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of different ways to frame this. One is when we were kind of deconstructing the problem, one of my colleagues actually floated a really helpful framing around sort of climate adaptation in general. And essentially, you think about it in three parts. The first bit is we need to stop making the problem worse. So stop building in high risk areas or areas that we know are going to be high risk. Seems really obvious and simple, but for many reasons it seems not to be. Partly because we have an enormously complex, planning and consenting and building environment, and to make any changes in that, it takes time. It's very complex, and as we've seen, that area of our world has been subject to various government reforms over the best part of the last decade, and we still haven't sort of landed something there. So that's a real challenge. Step two is really, if we're not going to be building in all the areas that we maybe have been in the past, but that are now high risk, we need to create other spaces. So what are the new spaces that people can build that are lower risk, and how do we make sure that they're, suitable for building, that they're consented, that they have infrastructure that enables people to develop in those spaces. And then thirdly, probably the most challenging one is how do you get people out of the areas that they're already in that we know are going to be high risk. So that kind of framing of those three buckets has been really helpful for us to think about the challenges. And then ultimately, in terms of South Dunedin, and I think probably many areas that are facing a kind of climate change or adaptation challenge, generally there are lots of options on the table. And if you think about those on a spectrum, as we have, with fight being at one end and flight being at the other, ultimately in South Dunedin we can continue to take the approach that we've taken largely over the last 150 odd years. So manage the water, engineer it, pumps, pipes, seawalls, keep the water out, keep the urban form largely as it is. Kind of moving a bit further along the spectrum towards the middle, we could continue to build infrastructure, but some of that could potentially be green infrastructure, passive solutions, recreating some of those spaces that used to be there. So daylighting streams, introducing water detention basins, sports fields that might flood, wetlands that might have a biodiversity co-benefit, that sort of thing, and start to kind of green up the urban area and start to create spaces where, hey, if it does flood, it floods in these areas rather than our homes and our living rooms. That also helps manage volumes. So maybe when the infrastructure that we do build in terms of pumps and pipes can be smaller and less expensive. So there's benefits that way. And then moving right the way along to the other end of the spectrum, ultimately it just might make more economic or social sense to move people out of harm's way. And this is where you're into a conversation around, managed retreat and what does that look like, and what are the sort of terms and conditions under which that occurs. Do people get bought out? If so, at market value? Who pays? Where do they go? All of these kind of really kind of existential questions that I think we're certainly grappling with in South Dunedin, and we are stepping through and I think making some real progress. But, we see this as a national discussion as well.
Very much so. That was going to be one of my questions. How far through tackling those questions are you? But I think it's one bite of the elephant by the sounds of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we stick with the elephant metaphor, with maybe eaten a leg, maybe the trunk, and we're certainly onto the main part. So we ended up over the course of sort of 2 or 3 years having gone through kind of a crowdsourcing process for ideas and options for South Dunedin, where we asked the community what they thought we should do. There was some international research on sort of best practice and adaptation space, working through to kind of essentially coming up with kind of a long list of here are all the different things you could do in South Dunedin to help manage water, and that used that para framework that is used for adaptation. So protect, accommodate, retreat, avoid, the different hazards. And then ultimately where we ended up was going back to that spectrum that I talked about, the fight and flight spectrum, coming up with 7 potential futures for South Dunedin. What could it look like in 2100? So in 75 years' time, if we took a purely, traditional grey infrastructure approach and built pumps and pipes and kept the water out, what would be the pros and cons, come 2100, all the way through to, what if we do a mix of everything, some pumps, some green space, move some people out, all the way through to the end of the spectrum where you just move everyone out. So we got to that stage in March earlier this year, and we introduced that to the community. I have to say it was received really, really well. I think partly because, all options are still on the table at that stage. So whatever people think about this work, they can kind of see a preferred option in that. Some really, really interesting takeaways from it were that the status quo, so keeping doing what we're doing, resulted in the worst overall outcomes for everybody. So that's sort of worst return on investment. Basically, the whole place starts to get wetter and wetter. All of the council infrastructure, the performance decreases. It's dealing with more water, but it's half filled with water, so it can only manage, half the volumes it can manage now. It's increasingly more expensive to maintain. The whole place just starts to degrade. You get essentially urban blight. The people that can afford to leave, those that can't afford to leave, stay, with all the kind of social and economic impacts that you have from that. So why that was really important for us was we kind of were able to quantify the impact of doing what we're currently doing. And we went out to the community and talked to them about that. The feedback that we got was that was the least popular of all the options on the spectrum. So what that meant for us was, hey, that's a massive mandate for change, which is quite a big hurdle to get over. And socially, that's really important, and politically. So then we were all of a sudden in a conversation about not should we change, but now what does change look like? And that's where you get into the other sort of 6 options on the spectrum. So should we be building lots of pumps and investing more in that way, or should we be moving people out? And ultimately, the feedback from the community was, actually, let's do a little bit of everything. So they landed kind of right in the middle of that spectrum and said, hey, we want you to build some infrastructure, traditional infrastructure, grey infrastructure, and particularly we want you to do that now and start mitigating some of that short-term flood risk. But we're also very open to this idea of recreating green spaces. That's what's really attractive to us. Who wouldn't want, a park or a wetland or some sort of green space or daylighted stream. We talked to people a lot about Christchurch as an example, and when you think about what you have in central Christchurch now, you've got a city that's gone through this enormously traumatic event, 15 odd years ago with the earthquakes, and they've recovered from that, and there's been an enormous amount of urban regeneration and redevelopment, and you've now got this space where you have this, Hagley Park, you've got the Avon River, you've got all this kind of regeneration in central Christchurch, all these amazing townhouse developments and things. And it's very much this sort of fabulous version of Christchurch. I think many people, certainly my personal view, is that Christchurch is a better version of itself now than it was sort of pre-earthquake. And I think one of the conversations that we've had with people around South Dunedin is, what's South Dunedin's version of that? Hopefully we don't get an earthquake, but we are going to get a slow-moving earthquake in the sense of climate change. So how do we look at places like Christchurch and say, hey, what would South Dunedin look like if we had, much more park space, if we had some streams that used to be there reinstated and maybe they've moved some of the water around? What if we rethought about all of our kind of old, cold housing and, built some better, warmer, drier homes, maybe more dense townhouse developments, and you could start to congregate those in particular areas that are lower risk. Hey, maybe that gives you sufficient density for more commercial activity. Oh, all of a sudden you've got public transport routes now work. So you're very much into this urban regeneration conversation where what you're selling people is not oh my goodness, the sky is falling on South Dunedin and we need to get it. We need to kind of dig in for as long as we can and then everyone gets out. No, actually, we're going to change, but we're going to change it for the better. And that's been enormously powerful in that conversation. And I think where we are in the process really is we've now narrowed that long list of 7 down to a short list of 3. We're just kind of working through those options now, and we're going to go back out to the community in early March next year, probably, and sort of say, hey, look, this is what these options look like in more detail. We're kind of narrowing, kind of looking really towards that middle of the spectrum. And then ultimately, by the end of next year, we want to have talked to the community again and then kind of narrowed that all down to one option, and that effectively becomes our master plan for South Dunedin. Aside from the feedback that we got from the community on the 7 options that we put out, or the 7 futures back in March, there were 2 key themes that also came through in the feedback. One was get on top of the short-term flood risk. So build more infrastructure now, please, so you can get on top of that. And I think that's universally supported, whether that's public or in the council, and there's a range of steps being taken to get on top of that. The second key theme to come back was we want to know more about this managed retreat concept. Who pays for what and when? What does that process look like? And if I'm a property owner that would be affected or potentially affected in future, what does that mean for me and what deal is on the table? So one of the things that we are doing in council now is basically trying to figure out a response to that. And in many ways, just as an example, when we come out early in the new year, we'll have the short list of futures. So we've taken that 7 and narrowed it to 3. We'll have also drilled down quite a long way. So be able to tell people in much greater detail, including sort of maps and geographic detail, what areas might be affected in which ways. A property owner will logically look at that and say, hey, well, in future A, my house is there for the next 100 years. In future B, it's only there for 50 years. And in future C, hey, they've got me moving out in 25 years. What does that mean for me? So what we're working on is a way of basically figuring out how the council might respond to that. So what does that mean in terms of infrastructure provision? So levels of service. Do we continue to provide a level of service at the current rate, or does that decline in some way, or does it change? What are the costs involved in that? We're very good and we have a big history of building for growth. Degrowth is a different challenge. How do you kind of withdraw services while continuing to meet a certain level of service? Similarly, land use change. If people are living in an area that in 50 years, actually, the master plan says should be a green space because it's going to be below sea level and that's going to be where we want water to congregate. Again, what does that mean for them in terms of their ability to live there, to develop it, to sell it? And then finally, I think there's the property acquisition question around, okay, if you are in one of those areas, is someone coming to purchase your property? Is that the council? Is that the central government? If so, at what value, at what price? And I think being able to answer those questions is going to be really, really critical for us. We probably won't have them all in March, but I think what we will have is this sort of a set of initial responses and a process for working through that. Because one of the things I remember a conversation during one of the community engagement sessions, talking to a gentleman. I said, flippantly, which of the futures do you like most? And he said, looked at me and said, well, it depends who's paying. If you're coming to buy my house at market value, well, actually, I quite like this one because it creates lots of green space and makes this a nicer area to live. If you're not, then I'd prefer you just fix the pumps and keep the place dry. These are fundamental elements to the question, and it does come down to that conversation around trade-offs, and probably we get into that space of some people are going to win and some people are going to lose more than others, and that's going to be very tricky, right? Because that raises these questions around equity, and a range of other kind of impacts.
Is there already discussion on how these solutions might be built into land use planning, or how there might be other ways to incentivize change? Or are we still engaging in what that vision state looks like to commit to?
I think that's an evolving space, but my experience with this stuff is it's incremental. So as an example, when we released the 7 futures and the risk assessment for South Dunedin back in March, I think 2 days later, 2 of the big townhouse developers in Dunedin came out and on the front page of the local paper said, we're no longer going to develop in South Dunedin anymore. So that wasn't the result of a plan change. It wasn't something that they were compelled to do. I don't know the exact reasons for why they would have done that, but you could assume that it's something to do with, they've looked at this, looked at the commercial realities of building, decided that there's probably higher risk and there might be additional cost involved, and actually commercially it makes more sense for them to develop in other areas. So I think the system is starting to react. We absolutely do not have all the answers yet, so we don't have this kind of blueprint for how this all works. And I mean, adaptation is highly, highly localized, which means you kind of have to come up with the local formula for how it applies. South Dunedin has a very complex hazard environment. It's got a particular social and economic kind of set of characteristics. Ultimately, I think what we're trying to do here is create a sort of social and economic kind of model that is viable. It can't just be dependent on these big taxpayer bailouts post-event. It can't just be based on, councils raising rates year on year on year on year to pay for this stuff. So we need to come up with a model where, in a South Dunedin context, for example, you might say, hey, well, there's a particular community it's zoned residential. People have been living there for 150 years, but it's super high risk and it's going to be below sea level and groundwater is going to be at surface level. So it's going to be a swamp in 40 years' time. Right next to that, there's a council-owned park that doesn't have that same risk profile. It's 3 meters higher. Logically, if you're looking at this, you'd swap those around. You'd have people living in the area that is higher, and you'd be playing golf and you'd be doing your sports and things on the areas that flood. So you're looking at those sort of options and opportunities. And continuing that example, if the council land is currently zoned for recreation, if you hypothetically rezone that for medium density residential, the value increases exponentially overnight. You've created that. How do you capture some of that, recycle some of that? Do you use that to fund the enabling infrastructure to allow the development to occur? You're then partnering with developers and others to make it happen. Does that then give the people in those low-lying flood-affected houses, do you have some sort of deal where they can move from where they are to those new houses because they're warmer, drier, denser? You can also get more people living there. So what we're really starting to look at is how do you make that system, how do you make those numbers add up, both in terms of kind of managing the water. So how do we manage the metrics of water we're supposed to have, expecting to have, but how do you manage the people? How do you manage the finances? And can we land something, a set of equations there that look like they might add up? I mean, realistically, we're not going to end up in some utopia where you do all this change and it's, easy and it's free and everyone wins, right? So there is an element of realism to it, but I'm optimistic that we can find a set of solutions, particularly in South Dunedin, where what we are offering at the end of it is better than what we have now, and that there's sufficient sort of upside to that both public and private sector will look at that and say, actually, that's something we want to invest in.
One issue that often comes up is around insurers and the risk that they might stop insuring house owners in flood risk areas. Have you had any discussions with insurance companies or the sort of trade organisation about that sort of thing?
Yes, we have, and I have to say the insurers and the banks have been great. So we reached out to a group of the larger insurers and banks maybe 18 months ago and said, hey, look, we're facing these challenges. We're trying to tackle them. We've got this process in place. Obviously, insurance and banking and finance is going to be a key part of this. Would really value your insights into that. And they responded extremely well, both in terms of the individual big banks and big insurers, but also their organisational bodies in terms of Insurance Council New Zealand and New Zealand Banking Association. So they've been really key partners in this. And it's very useful having a banker or an insurer in the room when you're kicking around ideas. They're very good at just putting a critical lens over it and helping you kind of see a commercial reality. So one of the kind of things to come out of that is that obviously the insurance industry's job is to price risk. And the risk assessment for South Dunedin showed that risk is already high and it's getting higher. And we know that that's going to happen. So rationally and logically, you look at that and say the price of insurance is going to go up for South Dunedin. So that creates a range of challenges for us, but it also helps us to look at this and say, okay, well, we've confirmed some of those assumptions now. So now when you're calculating, your different options or you're doing all your trade-offs, that's one kind of variable that now becomes relatively fixed. So it just helps with making your assumptions and your trade-offs. We've also started talking to them a bit around, if this is a slow race to the bottom for South Dunedin, where the place just gets wetter and wetter and the risk gets higher and higher, there's obviously a point in that where it stops becoming commercially viable, and you could expect to see, the price of insurance increasing, probably the insurance coverage retreating, and again, that becomes bad news for everyone. However, if this is a conversation about transitioning South Dunedin from a currently high risk environment to a future that might be lower risk, that's a fundamentally different conversation. All of a sudden now you're looking at, okay, we're talking about a transition. What's that transition phase look like? What role could the insurance or banking industry play in facilitating that transition? It's helped us kind of reframe it again as kind of being an opportunity, and what kind of partnership can these industries play in helping facilitate that change. We need the really big commercial players to be in the mix, and that works in the market. Not that depends on the market, but that takes sort of market forces into account.
Fascinating. A great way to be trying to think about how you can bring all those different strands together. And thanks from me, Jonathan. I really also enjoyed that conversation, hearing more about the South Dunedin project. And thank you for listening to this latest episode. We'll be back next month with our next podcast.